can you tell us the difference between unsaturated fats, saturated fats, and trans fats? And can you give us examples of each? I think that a lot of people understand that trans fats are quote unquote bad and unsaturated fats are quote unquote good, but I think that the saturated fats are a little bit of a gray area. Can you just explain those three to us and tell us kind of what we can eat versus what we can't eat?
Yeah. So one of the things I'll note, there's a reason why there's so much confusion about saturated fats. And it's because a lot of the research on fat was done in the 50s and 60s before we had the technology we needed to really actually understand all the different fatty molecules that existed. There's over 5,000 types of fats that get clumped into monounsaturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, saturated fats as the three main categories. And so real quick, saturated fats, this is actually just a throwback to chemistry. All of you that never thought you'd use your chemistry, you're about to, right? Saturated means that the fatty acid molecule has completely saturated carbons, which means all of the carbons have hydrogens around them. And so a way to think about it is the carbons make a straight line and there's a bunch of hydrogens. Because there's no kink, a monounsaturated fat is one, or a monounsaturated fat means one carbon is unsaturated, which means it kinks like this. Well, that's really easy to break in half for our body. Polyunsaturated means that there's multiple unsaturated carbons, which means there's multiple kinks, essentially. That's what those things mean. So saturated, no kinks, monounsaturated, one kink, polyunsaturated, multiple kinks. There's thousands of fatty acid molecules that fall into those three categories. And so in the 1950s and 60s, when they were originally doing fatty acid research, they hadn't categorized all of them yet. And so they just kind of clumped them into three categories and then made general comments about those. And so at base, saturated fats are harder to break, which is to say that you eat them, your body needs to break long chain or fatty acids, which most fatty acids are long chain, has to break them in half so that they can actually be metabolized into energy. So saturated fats tend to be harder to break down. Monounsaturated are the easiest, and polyunsaturated can also be easy. And so a couple notes there. Monounsaturated are the ones that most people know of when they think of healthy fats. So good sources of monounsaturated, olive oil, olives, avocados, avocado oil, most nuts and seeds, fatty fish. These are all high in monounsaturated. The comment is they're not only unsaturated, they are just a large percentage of unsaturated. Polyunsaturated is going to be other things that we basically think of. So you're going to have a lot of your, for example, people hear about omega-3s. So omega-3 polyunsaturated fats basically just means that the unsaturated fat is the third carbon, which is omega-3 versus omega-6 versus omega-9. It's just designating which carbon is unsaturated, so it's showing where it breaks. Omega-3 fats are the ones that a lot of people know. They're in fish, they're in nuts, they're in seeds. So what I'll note, this is what's kind of fun. Our healthy fats, avocados, olive oil, olives, all the things I mentioned, nuts, seeds, fatty fish. The reason that we consider them healthy is because they're actually the right ratio of all of those fats. They're 60+% monounsaturated, and then their polyunsaturated is a nice blend of omega-3s to omega-6s. And then they do contain saturated fat, but in small quantity. One of the things I'll note from there is to say that saturated fats, the reason they're controversial is because there's a lot of them. And for example, one of them is known as lauric acid. And lauric acid is a saturated fat, but it is also what's called a medium chain triglyceride, which is when you take a long chain fatty acid and cut it in half of it is what's called an MCT. That is a fat that is ready to be used as energy. It doesn't need broken down. Well, lauric acid is a saturated fat, which are called bad because they're hard to break down, but it's a size that doesn't need broken down. And so you see MCT oils, MCT powders. MCT is like, the latest and greatest energy. You see it for a keto diet. You see it in pre-workouts. That's why, is it's usable energy. Your body can consume the medium chain triglyceride and doesn't have to break it down in the liver. So it's ready to go into the Krebs cycle to become ATP. So that's an example of a saturated fat, but it doesn't have the connotation of being hard to break down because it doesn't actually be broken down. A common source of MCT or lauric acid is coconut oil. So everyone's all about coconut oil. Well, it's 10 grams of 14 of it is saturated, but 8 of those 10 grams are lauric acid. And so the saturated fat it has 2 grams of non-lauric acid, which is the equivalent of olive oil and avocados and nuts and seeds. So all of a sudden it's like, wait, it's a saturated fat, but it's healthy, quote unquote. Health behind fat is governed by its ability to be processed, broken down, and then its tendency to store. The other source of lauric acid that's very well known is actually grass-fed butter. So when you see everyone talking about their grass-fed butter, their Kerrygold butter, that's why. It's also worth noting that grass-fed beef is significantly higher in lauric acid than grain-fed beef. So you see this big push towards organic farming and grass-fed meats. That is why, is because the fat that is saturated is a lauric acid, which means it's easier to break down. The traditional saturated fats that we were afraid of, the long chain saturated fats, the common is they're hard to break down and they tend to get transported, and they're more likely to be transported by LDL, which is the type of cholesterol basically that's not, it's, L stands for lousy. It's the one that tends to store it as fat. It's also smaller molecules. They tend to get stuck in the arteries. They can start to create plaque and build up. So saturated fats got a reputation as raising LDL and as being more likely to store in the arteries, increasing risk of coronary artery disease and heart attack. That's only a small select few of the saturated fats. There are saturated fats that are not causing that problem. It's also to say that some saturated fat does have some value. So we got the saturated fat bucket. We're starting to better understand that it's not as simple as saturated fat equals good or bad. There's a lot of subcategories, but we oversimplified. Monounsaturated fats, no debating. They are the best quality, easiest to break down. They have a positive effect on a lipid profile. Your omega-6s, which are omega-6 is a type of polyunsaturated, it gets tricky because we see that our current diet in America is a really high ratio of omega-6 unsaturated fats to omega-3s. And so we see, oh, wait, these are correlated with inflammation. Your anti-inflammatory and inflammatory processes are balanced in part by your fatty acid profile. And once again, it's not as simple as one versus the other. We're talking about fatty acid profile, what ratios of thousands of fats you're consuming, right? Omega-6s are tricky because a lot of omega-6s are in some of like basically the oils that we consume that are in processed foods. And so it becomes the question of, is it the fats that are in the Cheez-It that's causing the problem? Or is it the fact that you're high on a Friday night binge eating a family-sized box of Cheez-Its after you already ate dinner? What's actually causing the lipid profile? Is it the omega-6 or is it the lifestyle factors surrounding? And so in a society filled with really poor lifestyle habits, we have a really high ratio of omega-6s, but it's also to say there's other components in our diet that raise questions. Is it the omega-6? We know that omega-3 is anti-inflammatory, which is why everyone takes fish oil now. And, we're talking about trying to increase our omega-3 concentration. It's not bad to get those omega-3s. So the main synopsis, saturated fats, if they're MCTs, they actually don't have the detrimental effect we used to see. And that's the case for why you want to buy grass-fed meat and that kind of thing. Omega-3 unsaturated fats, great. Omega-6s, they have need, but we consume way too many of them. We would love to see more of those be monounsaturated, which comes from our more original foods like our avocados, our olives, our nuts, our seeds, and our fish. And now to go all the way back to one of the other categories you brought up, trans fats. Trans fats are what happen when a human lab turns any of those fats into a saturated fat. So they transfer it, right? They transition it, so to speak. And when you take usually a monounsaturated fat because it only has one hydrogen missing, and you hydrogenate it, aka you bombard it with hydrogen, and then you saturate it. That is the most stable saturated fat. So you have made a saturated fat on steroids, if you will, right? And that's why trans fats get such a bad reputation, is they were a fat that was easy to break down. They got hydrogenated and they became the fat that is the single hardest thing to break down. And because you can't break it down, it does change your lipid profile. It does have a higher propensity to store in the arteries and all of those things. And so trans fats get a bad reputation for a reason. They end up kind of sharing the villain spotlight with their saturated fat cousin. That's not quite as bad, and also there's a lot of saturated fats, so it's not as simple as good or bad. There's a lot of subcategories. And then, like I said, you have your polyunsaturated fats and your monos, that it's more about the ratio of them. And that's what gets so tricky now, is we start to go, man, no wonder everyone's so confused on social media. Like, you can't say what I just said in 140 characters. It's just not that easy. We're sitting here talking about the 3 buckets on a nutrition label, and I just told you there's like 4,000 to think about. What am I supposed to do? The comment is you're supposed to have a good ratio of fats, and it comes from a very balanced diet. If you're eating a diet that has nuts, seeds, olives, oils, fish, those types of things in it, your ratios of fats are going to be in a much better balance. And a way to think about it is we're more interested in the overarching quality. So I want you to get a variety of fats, and there should be some from each bucket. If you're eating a diet that's really high in specifically saturated fats, that usually means you're not eating a diversity of foods. It means you're eating a lot of meat and a lot of cheese. If you're eating a lot of omega-6 only polyunsaturated fats, that tells me you're consuming a lot of oils, like seed oils, and you're consuming probably a lot of like packaged processed foods. If you're getting a blend of those things, it comes from a variety of foods. And the reason that everyone gets all excited about olive oil and avocados in particular is because they're the 2 things that have the most built-in ratio. So again, 14 grams of fat per tablespoon, 2 of it's saturated, which we try and keep our fats around 10% saturated fat. So they're built in as that ratio already. They have the 3-to-1 omega-3 to omega-6 poly built in, and they're 60% monounsaturated. So they are literally the perfect ratio of fats as is, which is why they get such a good reputation. Doesn't mean you should only consume them, but if your diet if you need 70 grams a day and 30 of it comes from olive oil, though that gives you a whole lot less wiggle room to have it coming from other things that throw off your balance. So when you think fats, think diversity is kind of the commentary.
Okay, so just a little recap to make sure I understand, because I'm a little bit slow sometimes, and this is a lot of information.
I just threw a lot at you, man. Yeah, that was real wordy in your defense.
So monounsaturated fats are healthy fats. Polyunsaturated fats are also healthy fats, although we consume a bit too many of them in a standard diet. Saturated fats are okay, but there's different types of saturated fats. Trans fats are human-made fats. And now you said we should get a few of each type of fats. Should we still consume some trans fats?
No, we
not
should
at all.
Not. And to be fair, the FDA actually banned them a couple of years ago. And so they actually don't exist in our food anymore.
Really?
Yeah.
I did not see. Yeah. This is why you're here.
Yep, this is why they pay me the big bucks, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, they actually banned them. They are no longer allowed in food.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that was actually one of the times. A lot of times government oversight swings and misses. That was one of the times that they hit a grand slam. That's something that needed to exist. There was no reason to be forcing those into foods. The things that you would have noticed them in, they were in icing, like cake icing. So if you went and bought a Betty Crocker or a Pillsbury or whatever icing, there would have been a lot of trans fat, which is what made the consistency and texture so smooth. A little bit was added to peanut butters, and it's what made peanut butters so much smoother. They were used basically to create a texture. And while that texture was quote unquote perfect, it was synthesized that way.
Right.
What it did to the insides was just not ideal.
Okay, so for everyone out there now wondering, which fats do I eat? Your answer was eat a variety of fats, a variety of monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and saturated fats. And can they just look at nutrition labels, or is there a certain protocol, like just stay with whole foods?
Yeah. And I think that's instead of, you'll get to a point where if you're trying to balance the exact fatty acid molecules, you're going to go nuts. And the research just isn't there yet for that. It's to say the best thing you can do is get as many of your fats from originating foods as possible. If you're looking at a way to think about it, other reason avocados and olives get a good reputation. If I squeeze an olive, oil comes out. Avocados are 70% fat compared to corn oil. Well, here's a fun thought experiment. So a tablespoon of oil is 14 grams of fat. An ear of corn has 0.1 grams of fat that make up a part of the cell wall of those corn kernels. And so if I want to get a tablespoon of fat from corn, I have to pull the fat from 140 ears of corn. In what world do I take the fat from 140 ears of corn in a tablespoon, consume that, and expect my body to have any idea what that is?
Yeah.
So origin fats being the dominant part of the diet, right? If you're going to try and get as high a percentage of your fats from real foods as possible, that's really the game. Things like nuts, things like seeds, things like olives, things like avocados, fatty fish, those are examples of foods that are going to give you really good quality fats that your body knows how to process. They're all already have the ratios built in. Focus on getting good fat sources. If you do that, you're going to be in a good place.